Sarah Martinez walked into the crowded coffee shop on a Tuesday morning, her heart racing as she noticed the stairs. The intricate tattoo covering her left arm drew attention wherever she went. But today felt different. The artwork depicted a military scene with dates and symbols that held deep meaning for her. Though most people only saw the bold black ink against her skin, she had moved to this small town 3 months ago, hoping for a fresh start after everything that happened. The job at the local library seemed perfect, quiet, peaceful, away from the chaos of her previous life. But small towns came with their own challenges, especially when you looked different from everyone else. As Sarah stood in line, she could hear whispers behind her. 2 women in their 50s were not trying very hard to keep their voices down. "Look at all that ink on her arm," one said with disgust. "What kind of person does that to themselves?" "Probably one of those troublemakers who never held a real job." The other woman nodded in agreement. "I heard she works at the library now. Can you imagine? What are we teaching our children when we let people like that around books and young minds? That tattoo probably represents some gang or something worse." Sarah's cheeks burned with embarrassment. She had faced judgment before, but it never got easier. The tattoo was sacred to her, representing the most important chapter of her life. But she had learned not to explain it to strangers. Most people had already made up their minds about who she was based on appearances alone. She ordered her usual black coffee and found a corner table, hoping to blend into the background. The morning crowd was typical for a Tuesday. Business people grabbing their caffeine fix, mothers with strollers, and retired folks reading newspapers. Everyone seemed to belong except her. From her seat, Sarah could still hear the 2 women talking. They had moved on to discussing how the town was changing, how outsiders were bringing their problems to their peaceful community. She tried to focus on her book, but their words stung. This was supposed to be her sanctuary, the place where she could start over and find peace. The bell above the door chimed as more customers entered. Sarah glanced up briefly and noticed a man in casual clothes, jeans and a simple polo shirt. He looked to be in his 40s with short gray hair and a confident posture that suggested military background. He scanned the room quickly, his eyes taking in every detail before settling on the counter to order. As he waited for his drink, Sarah noticed him looking in her direction. Great, she thought. Another person ready to judge her based on her appearance. She had become an expert at reading people's expressions, and she prepared herself for another uncomfortable encounter. But something in his expression was different. Instead of the usual mixture of curiosity and disapproval she was used to seeing, there was something else in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps even respect. It confused her because she was certain she had never met this man before. The 2 gossiping women were still at it, their voices growing louder as they discussed the decline of moral standards in their community. Other customers were starting to look uncomfortable, glancing between the women and Sarah, who was clearly the target of their conversation. Sarah felt trapped. She wanted to leave, but that would mean walking past the women and confirming whatever story they had created about her. She also refused to be driven away from a public place where she had every right to be. So she sat there, enduring the whispers and stares, wishing she could disappear. The man with the military bearing had received his coffee and was looking for a place to sit. There were several empty tables, but he seemed to be taking his time choosing one. Sarah noticed he kept glancing toward the 2 women, his expression growing more serious with each passing moment. She wondered if he was friend or family to them, if he would join their conversation and add his voice to their criticism. The thought made her stomach turn. She had dealt with enough judgment for one day, and the morning was just beginning. But instead of approaching the women, the man surprised everyone by walking directly toward Sarah's table. Her pulse quickened as he drew closer, unsure of what to expect. In her experience, when strangers approached her in public, it rarely led to pleasant conversations. The coffee shop seemed to grow quieter as people sensed something was about to happen. Even the 2 gossiping women paused their conversation to watch the interaction. Sarah looked up as the man stopped beside her table, her hands gripping her coffee cup tightly. What happened next would change everything, not just for Sarah, but for everyone who witnessed it. In that moment, her past and present were about to collide in a way she never could have imagined. The tattoo that had brought her so much judgment was about to reveal its true meaning. And the quiet morning in the small-town coffee shop was about to become anything but ordinary. The man stood there for a moment, studying the artwork on her arm with an intensity that made Sarah's heart pound. She had no idea that her carefully guarded secret was written in symbols that some people could read like words on a page, or that her past was about to catch up with her in the most unexpected way. Commander James Russell had been enjoying his retirement in the quiet town of Millbrook for 2 years. After 25 years in the Navy SEALs, he thought he had left the military world behind him. He came to the coffee shop every Tuesday morning, part of the routine that helped him adjust to civilian life. But today was different. The moment he walked in, he could sense tension in the air. Years of training had taught him to read situations quickly, and something was clearly wrong. He ordered his usual coffee and let his eyes sweep the room, cataloging potential threats out of habit. That was when he saw her, the young woman sitting alone in the corner, obviously uncomfortable as 2 older women nearby made no effort to hide their cruel comments. But it was not her discomfort that caught his attention. It was the tattoo on her left arm. From where he stood, James could make out enough details to recognize what he was looking at. The artwork was not just random designs or gang symbols, as the gossiping women assumed. It was a memorial piece, specifically military in nature. He could see dates, coordinates, and symbols that told a very specific story, one that few civilians would understand. His trained eye picked out the details that others missed. There was a Navy SEAL trident partially visible, worked into the larger design. Below it, he could make out what looked like dates and possibly coordinates. This was not the tattoo of someone seeking attention or making a fashion statement. This was the tattoo of someone honoring the fallen. James felt his jaw tighten as he listened to the women's ignorant comments. They had no idea what they were looking at, no understanding of the sacrifice that artwork represented. In his years of service, he had seen many such memorial tattoos, worn by warriors who carried the memory of their brothers and sisters in arms on their skin, because their hearts could not hold all the grief alone. He studied the woman more carefully. She was young, probably in her late 20s, with shoulder-length dark hair and tired eyes. There was something about her posture, the way she held herself, that spoke of military training. She sat with her back to the wall, positioned where she could see both entrances to the coffee shop. Her hands, when she reached for her coffee cup, moved with the controlled precision he recognized in fellow service members. The pieces were starting to come together in his mind. This was not just someone with a military tattoo. This was likely a veteran herself, possibly someone who had served with distinction if the complexity and placement of her memorial artwork was any indication. And here she was, being judged and ridiculed by people who had no idea what service and sacrifice meant. James made his decision. He had spent his career protecting those who could not protect themselves, and retirement had not changed his fundamental nature. This young woman was clearly a fellow warrior, and she was under attack by ignorant civilians. That was something he could not let stand. But as he prepared to approach her table, he noticed something that made him stop in his tracks. Now that he was closer, he could see more details of the tattoo. There were specific unit designations worked into the design, dates that he recognized, and coordinates that made his blood run cold. Afghanistan, Helmand Province. The dates matched a mission he remembered all too well. A rescue operation that had gone horribly wrong, resulting in casualties and heroic actions that never made it into the official reports. He had been part of the planning for that mission, though his team had been deployed elsewhere at the time. His eyes moved over the tattoo with new understanding. This was not just any memorial piece. This was a tribute to a specific operation, a specific group of fallen heroes. And if this young woman carried those details on her skin, it meant she had been there. She had been part of something that few people knew about, and even fewer would ever speak of publicly. The gossiping women were still talking, their voices growing more critical by the minute. Other customers were starting to leave, uncomfortable with the obvious bullying taking place. The young veteran sat there taking it all, her shoulders straight despite the obvious pain the comments were causing her. James had seen enough. He had spent his career serving alongside the bravest men and women he had ever known, and he recognized courage when he saw it. This woman had clearly served her country with honor, had paid prices that these civilian critics could never understand, and she deserved better than their ignorant judgment. He began walking toward her table, his steps measured and purposeful. The coffee shop grew quieter as people sensed something significant was about to happen. Even the two gossiping women paused their conversation to watch. As he drew closer, James could see the young woman tense up, probably expecting another confrontation. She had no way of knowing that he could read the story written on her skin, no way of understanding that he recognized not just her service, but the specific sacrifices that artwork represented. When he reached her table, James stopped and looked directly at the tattoo, taking in all the details he could see. The coordinates were definitely from that mission in Afghanistan. The dates matched perfectly. The unit designations confirmed what he had suspected. This woman had served in one of the most dangerous combat zones, in operations that the general public would never hear about. She looked up at him with a mixture of defiance and resignation, probably expecting him to add his voice to the chorus of criticism. She had no idea that she was looking at someone who understood exactly what her tattoo represented, someone who knew the cost of the service she had rendered to her country. The entire coffee shop was watching now, waiting to see what would happen next. The two gossiping women had stopped talking entirely, curious to see if this new customer would validate their harsh opinions about the tattooed stranger in their midst. What happened next would shock everyone in the room and change the atmosphere of the small-town coffee shop forever. James was about to do something that would reveal the true nature of the woman they had been so quick to judge, and demonstrate the respect that real heroes deserved. Without saying a word, Commander Russell straightened his shoulders and brought his right hand up in a perfect military salute. The gesture was crisp, precise, and filled with the kind of respect that could only come from one warrior acknowledging another. He held the salute for several long seconds, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. The coffee shop fell into complete silence. Every conversation stopped. Every movement ceased. Even the barista paused in the middle of steaming milk to stare at what was happening. The only sound was the soft jazz music playing from the speakers, suddenly seeming inappropriate for such a solemn moment. Sarah's eyes widened in shock, then filled with tears she had been holding back for months. She recognized the salute immediately, not the casual gesture of a civilian playing at military courtesy, but the real thing. This was the salute of someone who understood what it meant, who knew its weight and significance. Slowly, instinctively, Sarah rose from her chair. Her own hand came up in response, returning the salute with the same precision and respect. For a moment, the civilian coffee shop disappeared, replaced by the understanding that passed between two people who had served something greater than themselves. The two gossiping women watched in stunned silence, their mouths hanging open. The cruel comments they had been making suddenly seemed foolish and small. They did not understand what they were witnessing, but they could feel the significance of it. The atmosphere in the room had shifted completely, from mockery to reverence in the span of a heartbeat. Other customers began to realize they were witnessing something important. Some of them knew Commander Russell by sight. He was respected in the community, known for his military service and his quiet dignity. If he was saluting this young woman, there was clearly more to her story than anyone had realized. After holding the salute for what felt like an eternity, both James and Sarah lowered their hands simultaneously. The commander's face was serious but not unkind as he looked at her with the recognition of one service member acknowledging another. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice carrying the respect due to a fellow warrior. "Thank you for your service." Sarah's composure finally cracked. The tears she had been fighting spilled over as she whispered back, "Thank you for yours, sir." The simple exchange carried more weight than all the cruel comments that had preceded it. In those few words, Sarah felt seen and understood for the first time since she had arrived in this town. Someone finally recognized what her tattoo really represented, what she had sacrificed, what she had endured. James gestured to the empty chair across from her. "May I join you?" Sarah nodded, unable to trust her voice. As the commander sat down, the rest of the coffee shop remained unusually quiet, everyone sensing they had witnessed something profound even if they did not fully understand it. "I couldn't help but notice your ink," James said softly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Helmand Province, if I'm reading it correctly. Operation Mountain Shield." Sarah's breath caught. She stared at him in amazement. "You know about Mountain Shield?" "I was part of the planning committee," James replied. "My team was deployed elsewhere at the time, but I knew the brave men and women who went in. Not many people would recognize those coordinates or understand what they represent." For the first time in months, Sarah felt truly understood. Here was someone who knew about the classified mission that had changed her life forever. Someone who understood the weight of the memories she carried. "I was a Navy corpsman attached to the Marine unit," she said quietly. "We were ambushed on the third day. Lost 4 good people before we could extract the civilians we were sent to rescue." James nodded solemnly. He had read the after-action reports, knew about the casualties and the heroic efforts that had saved lives that day. Looking at this young woman now, he could see the cost that service had extracted from her. "The tattoo," he said. "It's for them, isn't it? Your fallen brothers and sisters." "Every detail," Sarah confirmed, her voice thick with emotion. "Their initials are worked into the design, the dates they died, the coordinates where we lost them. I promised their families I would carry them with me always." The 2 women who had been gossiping earlier were still watching, their expressions completely changed. The cruel satisfaction they had shown while mocking Sarah was gone, replaced by embarrassment and confusion. They were beginning to understand that they had been terribly wrong about the quiet young woman with the tattoo. Around the coffee shop, other customers were starting to piece together what had happened. Word spread quickly in small towns, and many of them knew Commander Russell's reputation. If he was showing this level of respect to the newcomer, she must be someone special. "I moved here hoping for a fresh start," Sarah continued, her voice stronger now. "I've been struggling with PTSD since I got out. The nightmares, the guilt about surviving when they didn't. I thought a quiet place like this would help me heal." James understood completely. He had seen many good soldiers struggle with the transition to civilian life, carrying invisible wounds that never fully healed. The judgment and mockery she had endured this morning would have been especially painful for someone already dealing with trauma. "This town could use more people like you," he said firmly. "People who understand what it means to serve, to sacrifice for others. Don't let ignorant comments from people who've never worn the uniform make you question your worth." Sarah wiped away her tears, feeling something she had not experienced since leaving the military, the support and understanding of a fellow warrior. The isolation she had felt since moving to Millbrook began to lift slightly. The gossiping women were gathering their things, looking ashamed and eager to leave. Other customers who had witnessed the exchange were looking at Sarah with new eyes, seeing not a troublemaker with questionable tattoos, but a hero who had served her country with honor. As word of the morning's events spread through Millbrook, Sarah found herself at the center of a transformation she never could have imagined. By afternoon, people were stopping by the library where she worked, not to check out books, but to apologize and introduce themselves properly. Mrs. Henderson, the library director, was one of the first to approach Sarah after hearing about what had happened at the coffee shop. The older woman had always been kind but distant, maintaining professional boundaries with her newest employee. Now she sat across from Sarah's desk with tears in her eyes. "I had no idea about your military service," Mrs. Henderson said softly. "My father served in World War II, and he always said that the young people who served in combat zones deserved our utmost respect. I'm sorry if I haven't shown you the appreciation you deserve." Sarah was touched by the gesture but also uncomfortable with the sudden attention. She had never wanted special treatment because of her service. "I just want to be treated like everyone else," she said. "I didn't serve for recognition or thanks. I served because it was the right thing to do." But the people of Millbrook seemed determined to make up for their earlier judgment. Throughout the day, veterans from the community began stopping by the library. Word had spread through the local VFW and American Legion posts that there was a combat veteran working among them who had been facing unfair treatment. Frank Morrison, a Vietnam veteran who ran the hardware store, was among the first to visit. He approached Sarah's desk with a mixture of respect and embarrassment. "I heard what happened this morning," he said gruffly. "Should have known better than to judge someone by appearances. We Vietnam guys faced enough of that when we came home." Sarah appreciated his kindness, but she could see the pain in his eyes. "Different wars, same struggles coming home," she said gently. "Thank you for understanding." More veterans followed throughout the afternoon. There was Maria Santos, who had served in Iraq as a truck driver, facing constant danger on supply runs. She hugged Sarah tightly when she learned about the PTSD struggles. "It gets better," Maria whispered. "Not easier, but better. And now you have people who understand." By closing time, Sarah had met more veterans in one day than she had encountered in her entire time in Millbrook. Each one had a story. Each one had faced their own challenges returning to civilian life. She began to realize that she was not as alone as she had thought. Commander Russell appeared just as Sarah was locking up the library. He had changed into more formal clothes and carried a small box under his arm. "How was your first day as Millbrook's most famous resident?" he asked with a gentle smile. "Overwhelming," Sarah admitted. "I never expected this kind of response. Part of me wishes everyone would just go back to ignoring me." "I understand that feeling," James said. "After I retired, I wanted to blend into the background too. But sometimes the community needs to see who you really are, especially when they've made wrong assumptions." He handed her the box he had been carrying. Inside, Sarah found a small American flag, neatly folded, and a certificate of appreciation from the local VFW post. "They wanted you to have this," James explained. "It's not much, but it's their way of saying thank you and welcoming you properly to the community." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the gesture. In all her months of living in Millbrook, she had felt like an outsider. Now suddenly, she was being welcomed as family by people she had never even met. "There's something else," James continued. "The VFW post meets every Thursday night. It's mostly older guys who served in Vietnam and Desert Storm, but they'd love to have a younger voice, especially someone with your experience. No pressure, but you're welcome anytime." The invitation meant more to Sarah than James probably realized. Since leaving the military, she had missed the camaraderie, the understanding that came from being around people who had shared similar experiences. Civilian life could be lonely for veterans, especially those dealing with invisible wounds. "I might take you up on that," she said. "I've been going to VA counseling sessions, but it's not the same as talking to people who've actually been there." "The VA doctors mean well," James agreed, "but there's something about sharing stories with other veterans that no textbook can teach them. We understand each other in ways that civilians can't, no matter how hard they try." As they walked out of the library together, Sarah noticed that people on the street were looking at her differently. Instead of the suspicious glances she had grown accustomed to, she saw nods of respect and friendly waves. The transformation was startling and somewhat surreal. "Is this what small-town life is always like?" she asked James. "One day you're an outcast, the next day you're the guest of honor." James chuckled. "Small towns can be unforgiving when they don't understand you, but once they accept you, you become family. The key is that they had to see past their assumptions to discover who you really are." They passed the coffee shop where the morning's drama had unfolded. Through the window, Sarah could see the two women who had been so cruel earlier. They looked up as she passed, and to her surprise, one of them raised her hand in a small, embarrassed wave. "Even they're coming around," James observed. "Guilt is a powerful motivator for change." Sarah was not sure she was ready to forgive the hurtful comments so quickly, but she appreciated that people were at least trying to make amends. The day had been emotionally exhausting, swinging from the pain of public mockery to the overwhelming warmth of community acceptance. "What happens now?" she asked as they reached the corner where their paths would diverge.
"Does everything go back to normal tomorrow?"
"That depends on you," James said thoughtfully. "You can retreat back into anonymity, or you can embrace being part of this community. Either choice is valid, but I think you might find that belonging somewhere is worth more than hiding." As word of the morning's events spread through Millbrook, Sarah found herself at the center of a transformation she never could have imagined. By afternoon, people were stopping by the library where she worked, not to check out books, but to apologize and introduce themselves properly. Mrs. Henderson, the library director, was one of the first to approach Sarah after hearing about what had happened at the coffee shop. The older woman had always been kind but distant, maintaining professional boundaries with her newest employee. Now she sat across from Sarah's desk with tears in her eyes. "I had no idea about your military service," Mrs. Henderson said softly. "My father served in World War II, and he always said that the young people who served in combat zones deserved our utmost respect. I'm sorry if I haven't shown you the appreciation you deserve." Sarah was touched by the gesture but also uncomfortable with the sudden attention. She had never wanted special treatment because of her service. "I just want to be treated like everyone else," she said. "I didn't serve for recognition or thanks. I served because it was the right thing to do." But the people of Millbrook seemed determined to make up for their earlier judgment. Throughout the day, veterans from the community began stopping by the library. Word had spread through the local VFW and American Legion posts that there was a combat veteran working among them who had been facing unfair treatment. Frank Morrison, a Vietnam veteran who ran the hardware store, was among the first to visit. He approached Sarah's desk with a mixture of respect and embarrassment. "I heard what happened this morning," he said gruffly. "Should have known better than to judge someone by appearances. We Vietnam guys faced enough of that when we came home." Sarah appreciated his kindness, but she could see the pain in his eyes. "Different wars, same struggles coming home," she said gently. "Thank you for understanding." More veterans followed throughout the afternoon. There was Maria Santos, who had served in Iraq as a truck driver, facing constant danger on supply runs. She hugged Sarah tightly when she learned about the PTSD struggles. "It gets better," Maria whispered. "Not easier, but better. And now you have people who understand." By closing time, Sarah had met more veterans in one day than she had encountered in her entire time in Millbrook. Each one had a story. Each one had faced their own challenges returning to civilian life. She began to realize that she was not as alone as she had thought. Commander Russell appeared just as Sarah was locking up the library. He had changed into more formal clothes and carried a small box under his arm. "How was your first day as Millbrook's most famous resident?" he asked with a gentle smile. "Overwhelming," Sarah admitted. "I never expected this kind of response. Part of me wishes everyone would just go back to ignoring me." "I understand that feeling," James said. "After I retired, I wanted to blend into the background too. But sometimes the community needs to see who you really are, especially when they've made wrong assumptions." He handed her the box he had been carrying. Inside, Sarah found a small American flag, neatly folded, and a certificate of appreciation from the local VFW post. "They wanted you to have this," James explained. "It's not much, but it's their way of saying thank you and welcoming you properly to the community." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the gesture. In all her months of living in Millbrook, she had felt like an outsider. Now suddenly, she was being welcomed as family by people she had never even met. "There's something else," James continued. "The VFW post meets every Thursday night. It's mostly older guys who served in Vietnam and Desert Storm, but they'd love to have a younger voice, especially someone with your experience. No pressure, but you're welcome anytime." The invitation meant more to Sarah than James probably realized. Since leaving the military, she had missed the camaraderie, the understanding that came from being around people who had shared similar experiences. Civilian life could be lonely for veterans, especially those dealing with invisible wounds. "I might take you up on that," she said. "I've been going to VA counseling sessions, but it's not the same as talking to people who've actually been there." "The VA doctors mean well," James agreed, "but there's something about sharing stories with other veterans that no textbook can teach them. We understand each other in ways that civilians can't, no matter how hard they try." As they walked out of the library together, Sarah noticed that people on the street were looking at her differently. Instead of the suspicious glances she had grown accustomed to, she saw nods of respect and friendly waves. The transformation was startling and somewhat surreal. "Is this what small-town life is always like?" she asked James. "One day you're an outcast, the next day you're the guest of honor." James chuckled. "Small towns can be unforgiving when they don't understand you, but once they accept you, you become family. The key is that they had to see past their assumptions to discover who you really are." They passed the coffee shop where the morning's drama had unfolded. Through the window, Sarah could see the two women who had been so cruel earlier. They looked up as she passed, and to her surprise, one of them raised her hand in a small, embarrassed wave. "Even they're coming around," James observed. "Guilt is a powerful motivator for change." Sarah was not sure she was ready to forgive the hurtful comment so quickly, but she appreciated that people were at least trying to make amends. The day had been emotionally exhausting, swinging from the pain of public mockery to the overwhelming warmth of community acceptance. "What happens now?" she asked as they reached the corner where their paths would diverge.
Does everything go back to normal tomorrow?
"That depends on you," James said thoughtfully. "You can retreat back into anonymity, or you can embrace being part of this community. Either choice is valid, but I think you might find that belonging somewhere is worth more than hiding." 6 months after the incident at the coffee shop, Sarah stood in front of the newly opened Millbrook Veterans Resource Center, watching as Commander Russell cut the ribbon for the official opening ceremony. The small storefront had been donated by a local business owner who was moved by Sarah's story and wanted to support the veteran community. The Resource Center had been Sarah's idea, but it had taken the entire community to make it a reality. Local businesses donated furniture and supplies. Volunteers painted walls and installed equipment. The town council fast-tracked the necessary permits. What had started as one woman's struggle with isolation had become a community-wide effort to support all veterans. "I can't believe this is real," Sarah said to Maria Santos, who had become her co-director at the center. Maria had moved to Millbrook, specifically to help with the project, bringing her own experience with veteran advocacy from her previous job in the city. "Believe it," Maria replied with a grin. "You started something here that's going to help veterans for years to come." The ripple effect of that one morning in the coffee shop just keeps spreading. Inside the center, veterans from throughout the Yao County were exploring the services now available to them. There was a computer lab for job searching and benefits applications, a quiet room for counseling sessions and support group meetings, a resource library filled with information about VA benefits, educational opportunities, and local services. But perhaps most importantly, there was a gathering space where veterans could simply be around other people who understood their experiences. The isolation that had plagued Sarah when she first arrived in Millbrook was something many veterans faced, and having a place where they belonged could make all the difference. Frank Morrison from the hardware store approached Sarah as she watched the opening festivities. "My grandson just got back from his second deployment in Iraq," he said. "He's been struggling with the adjustment, not sleeping well, having trouble connecting with his friends who never served. I think this place might be exactly what he needs." Stories like Frank's had been pouring in since word spread about the resource center. Veterans who had been suffering in silence were finding the courage to seek help. Family members who didn't know how to support their loved ones were finding resources and understanding. Commander Russell finished his remarks and approached Sarah and Maria. "The county supervisor wants to talk to you both about expanding this model to other towns," he said. "Apparently, Millbrook's Veterans Resource Center is getting attention from state-level officials." Sarah felt overwhelmed by how much had grown from such a simple beginning. She had moved to Millbrook hoping to disappear, to find a quiet place where she could deal with her own struggles privately. Instead, she had become the face of veteran advocacy in the region. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been in that coffee shop that morning," she said to James. "If no one had recognized what my tattoo really meant." "Someone else would have eventually," James replied. "Truth has a way of coming to light, but I'm glad it happened when it did, because it gave you the chance to turn your pain into purpose." Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a VA psychologist who had volunteered to provide counseling services at the center, joined their conversation. "I've been working with veterans for 15 years, she said, "and I've never seen a community embrace veteran support like Millbrook has. The waiting list for PTSD treatment in this area used to be 6 months. Now, with the resources available here and the community support, veterans are getting help within weeks." The transformation had been remarkable to witness. The same town that had initially judged Sarah for her tattoo had become a model for veteran integration and support. The change had not happened overnight, but it had been genuine and lasting. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself in conversation with Lisa Thompson, a young veteran who had recently separated from the Army. Lisa was dealing with many of the same struggles Sarah had faced: PTSD, difficulty adjusting to civilian life, and the feeling that no one understood what she had been through. "I heard about this place from a friend," Lisa said nervously. "I've been having a hard time since I got out. The nightmares, the anxiety, feeling like I don't fit in anywhere. I wasn't sure if I should come." Sarah remembered feeling exactly the same way when she first arrived in Millbrook. "I'm glad you did come," she said warmly. "And I want you to know that everything you're feeling is normal. It doesn't make you weak or broken, it makes you human." They talked for over an hour about the challenges of transitioning from military to civilian life. Sarah shared some of the coping strategies she had learned, while Lisa talked about her fears and struggles. By the end of their conversation, Lisa looked more hopeful than when she had arrived. "Will you be here next week?" Lisa asked as she prepared to leave. "Every Tuesday and Thursday," Sarah promised. "And you can call anytime if you need someone to talk to. That's what we're here for." As Lisa walked away, Sarah noticed she stood a little straighter, moved with a bit more confidence. It was a small change, but Sarah recognized it because she had experienced it herself. The relief that came from realizing you were not alone in your struggles. The evening was winding down, but Sarah was not ready to leave. She walked through the center one more time, taking in everything they had accomplished. The walls were decorated with photos and stories from local veterans spanning multiple generations. There was a memorial corner dedicated to fallen service members, including enlarged photos of the 4 Marines whose names were etched into Sarah's tattoo. Mrs. Henderson from the library had stayed late to help clean up after the opening ceremony. She found Sarah standing in front of the memorial wall, staring at the photos of her fallen comrades. "They would be proud of what you've built here," Mrs. Henderson said softly. "You've turned your grief into something that helps others heal." Sarah nodded, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever she thought about the friends she had lost. But tonight, the pain was mixed with something else, a sense of purpose and fulfillment that she had not felt since leaving the military. "I used to think the tattoo was just for them," Sarah said, touching her arm gently, "a way to carry their memory and honor their sacrifice. But now I realize it was also for me. It brought me to this moment, to this community, to this work that feels important." As the last volunteers finished cleaning up and prepared to leave, Commander Russell approached Sarah with a serious expression. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. "I've been in contact with some of my former colleagues in Washington. Word about what you've accomplished here has reached some high levels." Sarah felt a familiar anxiety creep in. She had never wanted her military service to become public knowledge, and the attention the Resource Center was receiving sometimes felt overwhelming. "They want to invite you to speak at a national conference on veteran reintegration," James continued. "Your story of how one community transformed its understanding of veterans could help other towns across the country." The invitation was both flattering and terrifying. Sarah had come so far from the isolated, struggling veteran who had hidden in the corner of the coffee shop just months earlier. But the idea of sharing her story on a national stage felt like more exposure than she was ready for. "I don't know if I'm the right person for something like that," she said hesitantly. "I'm still figuring things out myself." "That's exactly why you're the right person," James replied. "You're not speaking as someone who has all the answers. You're speaking as someone who found a way forward, who turned struggle into strength. That's a message other communities need to hear." Sarah looked around the Resource Center one more time, thinking about all the veterans who had already found help there and all the others who would benefit in the future. If sharing her story on a larger stage could help create more places like this, more communities that understood and supported their veterans, maybe it was worth stepping outside her comfort zone again. "Can I think about it?" she asked. "Of course," James said. "But remember, sometimes the most important work we do starts with the courage to be vulnerable, to let people see our struggles and our healing. You've already done the hard part. Now it's just about reaching more people who need to hear that recovery is possible." 1 year later, Sarah stood on the stage of the National Veterans Conference in Washington, D.C., looking out at an audience of over 2,000 people, military officials, VA administrators, veteran advocates, and community leaders from across the country had gathered to hear about innovative approaches to veteran reintegration. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the microphone, but her voice was strong and clear when she began to speak. The tattoo on her arm was fully visible, no longer something she felt the need to hide or explain apologetically. "A year and a half ago, I was sitting in a small-town coffee shop, listening to strangers mock my tattoo and judge me based on their assumptions about who I was," Sarah began. "I felt invisible, misunderstood, and completely alone. Today, I stand before you representing a community that has become a national model for veteran support and integration." The audience was completely attentive, many of them leaning forward to catch every word. Sarah had learned to be comfortable with public speaking, but this was by far the largest crowd she had ever addressed. "The transformation didn't happen because of government programs or policy changes," she continued. "It happened because one person took the time to see beyond surface appearances and recognize the true meaning of service and sacrifice. It happened because a community chose understanding over judgment, inclusion over exclusion." Behind her on the screen, photos from Millbrook showed the Resource Center, the veteran support groups, and the community events that had become regular features of town life. The images told the story of a place that had embraced its veterans and been strengthened by their presence. Commander James Russell's salute in that coffee shop did more than restore my dignity, Sarah explained. It educated an entire community about the reality of military service and the challenges veterans face when they come home. It turned my personal struggle into a community-wide mission to support all veterans. In the audience, Sarah could see James sitting with Maria Santos and several other veterans from Millbrook who had traveled to Washington to support her presentation. Mrs. Henderson was there too, along with Frank Morrison and even Mrs. Patterson from the coffee shop, who had become one of the Resource Center's most dedicated volunteers. The Millbrook Veterans Resource Center has served over 300 veterans in its first year, Sarah reported. But more importantly, it has changed how an entire community thinks about military service and veteran reintegration. Children in our schools now learn about veteran contributions. Local businesses actively recruit veteran employees. Families feel comfortable seeking help when their loved ones are struggling. The statistics were impressive, but Sarah knew the real impact was in the individual stories. Veterans like Lisa Thompson, who had found purpose and community after months of isolation. Families who had learned how to support their struggling. Service members. Young people who had developed respect and understanding for those who served their country. The model we've developed in Millbrook can be replicated anywhere, Sarah concluded. It doesn't require massive funding or complex bureaucracy. It requires communities willing to look beyond assumptions, to listen to veteran experiences, and to create spaces where those who served feel valued and understood. The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the response, amazed at how far she had traveled from that morning when she felt so alone and judged. The journey from isolation to advocacy had not been easy, but it had been transformative in ways she never could have imagined. After her presentation, Sarah was surrounded by people wanting to learn more about the Millbrook model. City officials, nonprofit leaders, and veteran advocates exchanged contact information and made plans to visit the Resource Center. Several communities announced plans to implement similar programs in their own towns. During a break between sessions, Sarah found a quiet moment to call the Resource Center back in Millbrook. Maria answered on the second ring, updating her on the day's activities. 3 new veterans had come in seeking services, 2 local businesses had offered job training programs, and the high school had requested a presentation about veteran experiences for their social studies classes. "How's the big city treating our famous director?" Maria asked with a laugh. "It's surreal," Sarah admitted. 2 years ago I was hiding from the world, and now I'm supposedly an expert on veteran reintegration. Sometimes I feel like I'm in someone else's life. "You're exactly where you're supposed to be," Maria assured her. "You've helped more veterans in the past year than most people help in a lifetime. Don't forget that when the spotlight gets overwhelming." As Sarah returned to the conference sessions, she reflected on the unexpected path her life had taken. The tattoo that had once brought her shame and judgment had become a symbol of healing and community transformation. The military service that had left her with invisible wounds had evolved into a mission to help other veterans find their way home. That evening at the conference banquet, Sarah was presented with a national award for veteran advocacy. As she accepted the honor, she thought about the 4 Marines whose names were permanently etched into her skin, whose sacrifice had inspired everything that followed. "This award belongs to every veteran who has struggled with the transition to civilian life," she said from the podium. "To every community that has chosen understanding over judgment, and especially to those who gave their lives in service to our country and continue to inspire us to be better, to do better, to serve others." In the audience, Commander Russell wiped away a tear as he watched the young woman he had saluted in a small-town coffee shop accept recognition for changing how America supports its veterans. The simple act of recognizing a fellow warrior had rippled outward in ways none of them could have predicted, creating waves of positive change that would continue long into the future. Sarah knew that her work was far from over. There were still veterans struggling in isolation, communities that needed education about military service, and barriers to overcome in supporting those who had served. But she also knew she was no longer facing those challenges alone. She had found her purpose, her community, and her voice in advocating for those who had sacrificed for their country. The tattoo on her arm would always carry the memory of fallen comrades, but now it also represented hope, healing, and the power of one person's courage to transform an entire community's understanding of service and sacrifice.